Hello everyone, and welcome back to Shadowman Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Thomas Mackenzie, and I've been a park ranger for 18 years. I've pulled 47 people out of situations that should have killed them. Frostbite, hypothermia, bear attacks, avalanches, you name it, I've seen it. I used to think I'd seen everything the wilderness could throw at a person. Condemned. I was wrong. Always ask me about the supernatural stuff. Do I believe in Bigfoot? What about ghost stories? I always gave them the same answer. The wilderness is dangerous enough without making up monsters. I figured the old native stories about hunger spirits were just ways to explain starvation madness. When people get desperate enough, hungry enough, cold enough, they do terrible things. Give those terrible things a name and you get legends. That was before February 1978, before Kantishna. With Denali National Park in Alaska. It's beautiful country, but it'll kill you if you're not careful. In winter, it's like another planet. The Kantishna mining district sits about 95 miles from the nearest road, deep in country so remote that most maps don't bother with details. In February, with temperatures hitting 60 below and lower, it might as well be the dark side of the moon. That's where Dr. Helen Vargas and her research team went missing. The call came in on a Tuesday. 3 missed radio check-ins from a 5-person geology team studying permafrost formations near the old Kantishna mines. Standard protocol says we wait for 4 missed check-ins before launching a search, but something about this one felt wrong from the start. Maybe it was the weather. We'd been having the coldest February on record. The temperature hadn't climbed above -40 in 3 weeks. Our supply plane couldn't get through, and even our satellite phones were acting up because of some solar storm. Or maybe it was the silence. You have to understand, in winter, the Alaska wilderness isn't quiet. It's full of sounds. Ice cracking, wind howling, trees splitting from the cold. But that February, everything went quiet. Even the ravens stopped flying. Old-timers in the Park Service started talking about the last time they'd seen weather like this. 1923, they said. The year of the Kantishna cave-in. I loaded up my snowmobile and headed out alone. I gave us temperature that we were actually the government before. I loaded up my snowmobile and headed with 40 to the motors. I worked with again the Kantishna govern before. I loaded up my snowmobile and headed out of the cities that we sleep. The last one that we agruted had laughed, but also had turned someone. It is not a great with slow. I loaded up my snowmobile and headed out the related memory and coption for the CERM. The related memory was a big memory, which was a big black flit. It has crossable late of the Kantishna cave. The 10 was going to avay that the powerful ever of the year. Standard winter rescue kit, emergency shelter, medical supplies, food for a week, satellite phone, flares, and enough warm clothes to survive 3 days at 70 below. The ride to Kantishna takes 8 hours in good weather. In this cold, with the wind cutting through every layer you wear, it felt like forever. Started about 20 miles out. First, it was the snow. I've been riding snowmobiles in Alaska for most of my adult life. I know what snow should feel like under the tracks. This snow felt different, harder. Like riding over broken glass instead of powder. Every bump sent a sharp crack through the machine that I felt in my bones. Before then, the engine started cutting out. Bribery. My snowmobile was a brand new Arctic Cat, barely 6 months old. I'd checked it myself before leaving, but about 50 miles from the research camp, it started sputtering like it was running on bad gas. The engine would die for 10 or 15 seconds, then roar back to life. Each time it happened, the silence that filled those seconds was so complete, it made my ears ring. All stopped twice to check the engine. Nothing wrong that I could see. Spark plugs clean, fuel line clear, air filter fine. But every time I'd start it back up, my hands would shake worse than they should from just the cold. Confiscated, the third time it died, I heard something else in the silence. Screaming ships. Sluggish. Not human screaming, not animal screaming either. Something in between, high and sharp and wrong, like metal being twisted apart. It lasted maybe 5 seconds, coming from somewhere ahead of me in the direction of the camp. Then my engine caught again, and the sound was gone. I told myself it was just ice shifting somewhere, or maybe a tree falling. Sound travels funny in that kind of cold. But I started checking my rifle more often, and I pushed the snowmobile harder than I should have. The research camp appeared just as the sun was setting. 4 orange tents in a neat square around a central area with equipment. Generator running, lights on. Everything looked normal from a distance. Everything, the silence. I shut off the snowmobile 50 yards from camp and listened. The generator was humming along fine. I could see lights in 2 of the tents. But no voices, no radio chatter, no sounds of people living and working. "Hello, the camp," I called out. My voice died in the air like the cold was swallowing it. "This is Ranger Mackenzie with Park Service." I approached the tents with my rifle ready. Not because I expected trouble from the research team, but because something felt predatory about the whole scene, like something was watching me from the darkness beyond the lights. The first Vargas's. I unzipped the flap and looked inside. Sleeping bag laid out neat, personal items organized. A journal open on the camp table with an entry dated 3 days ago. The handwriting looked normal until the last line, which trailed off in the middle of a sentence about core samples. The second tent belonged to Dr. James Peterson, the team leader. Same setup. Everything normal except for a coffee cup sitting on the table. Still full. When I touched the side of the cup, it was frozen solid. But not covered with ice like it should be after sitting in 60 below weather for 3 days. Just frozen clear through, like it had been flash frozen from the inside out. The third and fourth tents were empty, but their occupants had left in a hurry. Sleeping bags twisted and thrown aside. Personal items scattered. In one tent, I found a boot. Just one boot, sitting in the middle of the floor. No sign of its partner or the person who'd been wearing it. The equipment tent held the radio setup. I tried raising park headquarters, but got nothing except static that sounded almost like whispered voices if you listened too long. The antenna was intact, all connections solid. The radio was getting power from the generator. It should have worked. That's when I found the first body. Dr. Martinez was about 30 feet from camp, lying face down in the snow. I almost missed him because the snow had drifted over him in a strange pattern, like it had been arranged. When I brushed it away and turned him over, I had to sit down hard in the snow. Something had been eating him. I've seen bear attacks. I've seen what happens when predators get to a body. This wasn't that. The bite marks were too big, too regular, and they were concentrated on the arms and legs, like whatever did it was trying to keep him alive as long as possible. The expression on his face wasn't fear or pain. It was confusion, like he couldn't understand what was happening to him. But the worst part was that the body was still warm. In 60 below weather, a human body should freeze solid within hours. Dr. Martinez felt like he'd died minutes ago, not days, and there was no blood in the snow around him, not a drop. I was still staring at the body when I heard the voice. "Help me." Weakened, female, coming from somewhere beyond the edge of camp. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and followed the voice into the darkness. "Where are you?" I called out. "Here, down here." Butterflies, I followed the voice to what looked like a crack in the ground. When I shined my light down, I realized it was the entrance to an old mine shaft. The wooden supports looked like they dated back to the 1920s, when this area was still being worked for gold. "I'm coming down," I called. "Are you injured?" The shaft went down about 15 feet before opening into a small chamber. My flashlight beam found Dr. Helen Vargas huddled in the far corner, wrapped in a sleeping bag. She was alive, but barely. Her lips were blue, and her eyes had that glassy look that comes with severe hypothermia. "Dr. Vargas? I'm Ranger Mackenzie. I'm here to help." She looked at me like she couldn't quite believe I was real. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered. "It's still up there. It's always up there now." I got her into my emergency bivvy and started warming packs, basic hypothermia treatment. But she kept talking, and what she said made my hands shake worse than the cold. It took Peterson first. We were all in the equipment tent, going over core samples. Peterson went outside to check the weather station. We heard him scream, but when we ran out, he was gone. Just his tracks leading away from camp, and then nothing. Like he just vanished. I kept working on her, getting her temperature up. "What about the others?" Wilson and Chen went after him. Found him about a mile from camp. He was eating him, while he was still alive. Wilson tried to pull it off, but it turned on him. Chen ran. I found pieces of both of them the next morning. "What did it look like?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Like a person, but wrong, too tall, too thin. Its eyes reflected light like an animal's, but blue, ice blue. And when it breathed, frost would come out of its mouth even though the air was already frozen." She grabbed my arm with fingers so cold they burned. "It's not an animal, Ranger. It used to be human. It told us. It remembers being human." "What do you mean it told you?" "It can talk. It knows things. It knew Peterson's name. It knew about his daughter back in Seattle. It would call to us in Peterson's voice after it finished with him, trying to get us to come out of the tents." I was about to ask more questions when we both heard it. Peterson's voice, coming from the shaft entrance above us. "Helen? Helen, are you down there? I'm hurt. I need help." Dr. Vargas pressed her face against my shoulder and started shaking. "That's not him," she whispered. "Peterson's been dead for 2 days." "Helen, please. I'm bleeding. I can't find the others." If I hadn't been looking at Peterson's body 20 minutes ago, I would have believed it completely. Even knowing it was impossible, part of me wanted to call back. "It's been doing this for hours," Vargas whispered. "Yesterday it was Wilson's voice. Before that, Chen's. It learns them somehow." I clicked off my flashlight and pulled out my rifle. The voice kept calling, sometimes Peterson, sometimes switching to one of the others. Always hurt, always needing help, always trying to convince us to come up. Clinging, we waited in the dark for what felt like hours. Eventually, the voices stopped, but I could hear movement up there. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the snow. Whatever it wasn't leaving. "There's another way out," Vargas said. "This shaft connects to the main mine tunnel about 50 feet back. I found it yesterday when I was hiding." Our gear and moved deeper into the mine. The tunnel was old but solid, carved into permafrost that had kept the wooden supports from rotting. My flashlight beam showed pick marks on the walls and rusted mining equipment scattered around. "How long have you been down here?" I asked as we walked. "Since yesterday morning. I've been afraid to go back up. Every time I try, I hear it moving around up there." We reached a junction where 3 tunnels met. Vargas pointed to the left passage. "That one leads to an entrance about a 1/4 mile from camp. But what? There are things down here too. Not the creature. Other things. I found them yesterday." She led me down a side passage to a chamber that opened up like a small room. When I shined my light around, I understood what she meant. Bombed. Bodies. Old ones. Maybe 15 or 20. People. All sitting against the walls like they'd just laid down to rest. Their clothes looked like 1920s mining gear. Pickaxes and shovels scattered around, and all of them had the same expression Dr. Martinez had worn. Confusion, like they didn't understand what was happening to them. But these bodies weren't fresh like Martinez. They were mummified, preserved by the cold and dry air of the mine. Some still had flesh on their bones, others were just skeletons in rotted clothes. "Cave in," I said, understanding. The 1923 cave-in the old-timers talk about. They've been down here for 55 years. Look closer, Vargas said. I moved my light over the bodies more carefully. That's when I saw the bite marks. The same large, regular teeth marks that had been on Martinez, but on bones that had been gnawed clean decades ago. Been here all along, I realized, since 1923. One of them survived the cave-in, Vargas said, but not as a person. That's when we heard the sound from deeper in the mine, a scraping noise like something being dragged across stone, then a voice echoing off the tunnel walls. My voice. Dr. Vargas, I found another way out. Follow my voice. But I was standing right next to her. The thing had learned my voice from hearing me call into the camp, and it was down here with us. Run, I said. We ran back toward the main tunnel, our flashlight beams dancing wildly off the walls. Behind us, the scraping got louder, closer, and my own voice kept calling, now mixed with Peterson's and Wilson's and Chen's, all talking at once in a horrible chorus. We reached the main tunnel and turned toward what Vargas said was the other exit. But when we got there, we found the entrance sealed, not by a cave-in, by ice. Solid ice, like someone had poured water over the opening and let it freeze. It blocked us in, Vargas said. It herded us down here. The voices were getting closer, but now they weren't just calling for help. They were laughing, a sound like breaking glass that echoed off the tunnel walls and seemed to come from everywhere at once. That's when my radio crackled to life. Base to Ranger Mackenzie. Come in, Mackenzie. Mackenzie, I'm in the Kantishna mine system with one survivor. We need immediate evacuation. Copy that, Mackenzie. We have a helicopter inbound. ETA 20 minutes. It was the best news I'd heard in days, but Vargas was shaking her head. Your radio wasn't working before, she said, and there's no way a helicopter can fly in this weather. She was right. I tried the radio a dozen times since the mine system, but there wasn't Extraol as well. I proved the radio wasn't can fly in this weather. I trumping to it method in the world. She was right. It was right. The radio was said. We more video, and it was more aggressively with a COVID. But I moved by this government coming in for. She was right. It was right. I'd tried the radio a dozen times since arriving at camp, and the wind outside was still howling at 60 below. No pilot would risk it. Mackenzie, we're having trouble with your signal. Can you make it to the surface for pickup? I looked at Vargas. Her face was pale, and not just from the cold. It's learning, she whispered. It heard us talking about rescue. It's trying to get us back to the surface. The scraping sound was much closer now, and underneath it I could hear breathing, slow, deliberate breaths that came out as clouds of frost, even in the freezing air of the tunnel. I turned off the radio and checked my rifle. How many bullets do you think it would take to stop something that's been dead for 55 years? I don't know, Vargas said, but I guess we're about to find out. The breathing stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat and Vargas's quick, shallow gasps. Our flashlight beams lit up maybe 30 feet of tunnel in each direction, leaving everything else in absolute darkness. Something was out there, just beyond the light, watching us. Maybe it's gone, Vargas whispered. That's when it spoke. Blitz. Not in Peterson's voice or mine, its own voice. A sound like wind through broken glass, barely human, but carrying words we could understand. 55 years, it said. 55 years I waited. So hungry, so cold. They left me here to starve. A shape moved at the edge of our light. Too tall, like Vargas had said, maybe 9 feet, thin enough that I could see the tunnel wall through its body in places. The cave-in wasn't an accident, it continued. The mine owner sealed us in, said the claim was worthless, left 23 of us to die rather than pay for our work. You don't have to do this, I called out, keeping my rifle trained on the shadow. We can help you. It laughed. The sound made ice crystals form in the air. Help me? I tried help. For weeks after the cave-in, I shared my food with the others. When the food ran out, I shared my water. When the water ran out, it moved closer, and I could see its eyes now, blue as glacier ice, reflecting our flashlight beams. When everything ran out, I shared what was left. You ate them, Vargas said. Flashlight. I survived, but surviving changed me. The cold and the hunger and the darkness, they got inside me, changed what I was, what I needed. It stepped fully into our light. I've seen a lot of terrible things in 18 years of wilderness rescue, but I've never seen anything like what stood in that tunnel. I could see that in the basic shape, the way it moved, the intelligence in those ice-blue eyes. But everything else was wrong. Its skin was white as fresh snow and thin enough to show dark veins underneath. Its fingers were too long, ending in black nails that looked more like claws. And its mouth, too sharp, too many, set in jaws that could open wider than any human mouth should. I don't just eat meat anymore, it said. I eat fear, despair, the taste of hope dying. Your friends fed me for days before their bodies gave out. I fired. The bullet hit center mass and passed right through like it was shooting.
Fog.
The creature didn't even step backward. Iron and lead, it said. Tools of the warm world. This is a cold place, a hungry place. Your warm world tools have no power here. It moved fast, faster than anything that size should be able to move. 1 second it was 15 feet away, the next it was reaching for Vargas with those impossible fingers. I dove between them, tackling Vargas and rolling us both deeper into the tunnel. The creature's claws missed us by inches, gouging deep scratches in the tunnel wall where our heads had been. The thermite charges, Vargas gasped as we scrambled to our feet. In the mining equipment, they use them to blast through ice. I understood immediately. We couldn't kill something that was already dead, but maybe we could bury it again. Defiance. The creature was following us, taking its time now. It knew we were trapped. I could hear it talking to itself in multiple voices. Peterson, Wilson, Chen, Martinez, and others I didn't recognize. Probably miners from 1923. Arbitrarily. We reached the chamber with the old bodies. Mining equipment was scattered everywhere, including 3 cases marked with warning symbols. Thermite charges, used for cutting through ice and permafrost. Can you set them off? I asked Vargas. I think so, but we'll need to get close to the main support beam. If we can bring down this section, we'll be buried too. Blackmail. Maybe, or maybe we can make it to the side tunnel before the roof comes down. The creature appeared at the chamber entrance. In the confined space, it looked even bigger. Its head brushed the tunnel ceiling, and its arms seemed to stretch from wall to wall. Time to join the others, it said in my own voice. Time to feed the cold. I grabbed 2 of the thermite charges while Vargas worked on the 3rd. The creature moved toward us, confident and slow. It had been hunting in these tunnels for 55 years. It knew every inch. What it didn't know was that I'd spent 2 years in the Army Corps of Engineers before becoming a ranger. Hey, I called out. You want to know what the difference is between you and me? Stopped, curious. I've been trained to blow things up. I triggered all 3 charges at once. Thermite burns at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In a confined space filled with permafrost and 55-year-old wooden supports, it's like setting off a small bomb. The creature screamed, not in any human voice, but in its own horrible sound like breaking glass. The superheated air hit it like a physical blow, and for the first time, I saw it look afraid. Then the tunnel roof came down. I grabbed Vargas and dove for the side passage as tons of ice and rock crashed down behind us. The air filled with dust and steam and the smell of burned wood. The sound was like the world ending. Brightness. We crawled through the side tunnel as fast as we could, the roof creaking and shifting above us. Behind us, I could hear more cave-ins as the thermite fire spread to other support structures. And underneath it all, that terrible screaming, getting fainter and fainter. another chamber just as our tunnel collapsed completely. For a moment, everything was quiet except for our breathing and the distant sound of settling rock. Then Vargas found a way up. "There's a vertical shaft here," she said. "I can see stars." It took us 6 hours to climb out of that mine shaft, 6 hours of working our way up through narrow passages and unstable rock, following a thin line of starlight that seemed impossibly far away. Vargas died during the climb. The creature that killed her, it wasn't even the cold, though that certainly didn't help. It was her injuries from hiding in the mine for 2 days, the hypothermia, and the shock of everything we'd been through. About halfway up, she just stopped climbing. "I can't," she said. "I'm too tired." I tried to help her, but she was already going into shock. Her core temperature had dropped too low, for too long. Even if I'd had a full medical team with me, I don't think we could have saved her. "Tell people," she whispered, before she died. "Tell them what really happened here. Don't let them cover it up." But of course, they did cover it up. By the time the real rescue helicopter arrived 3 days later, the official story was already written. Avalanche. Research team caught in a freak snowslide while investigating unstable permafrost formations. Dr. Vargas died of injuries sustained in the slide. The other team members were presumed buried under tons of snow and ice. Chrome mine collapse was listed as a secondary effect of the avalanche. Seismic activity from the snowslide had destabilized the old mining tunnels. Very unfortunate, but these things happen when you work in dangerous country. They transferred me to the Anchorage office a month later. Administrative position, good pay, regular hours, no more wilderness rescue calls. The official reason was that I'd suffered severe frostbite during the rescue attempt and was no longer fit for field duty. The real reason was that I'd started asking too many questions about the 1923 cave-in. I buried in old territorial files. The Kantishna mine had been profitable, not worthless like the creature claimed. But there had been a dispute between the miners and the mine owner over working conditions and pay. The miners had threatened to strike. 3 days later, there was a cave-in. No rescue attempt was made. The mine owner filed an insurance claim and moved to California. 23 men were left to die in those tunnels, all except one. Facilitated for 7 years now. I live in a small house in Anchorage with my dog and my memories. I don't talk about Kantishna anymore. People think I'm crazy when I do. But sometimes, on the coldest nights in February, I get reports from other rangers, hikers who go missing in remote areas, hunting parties that never come back, always in winter, always in places where the temperature drops below 40, and always near abandoned mines. The authorities have different explanations: exposure, equipment failure, poor planning. They never mention the voices that surviving witnesses sometimes report hearing. Voices calling for help in languages that sound almost human but not quite. They never mention the bite marks either. Alphabetical. I know what's out there, not just in Kantishna but in other places where people have died hungry and cold and alone. Places where survival required doing terrible things. The Wendigo isn't just one creature. It's what we become when the cold and hunger strip away everything human inside us. The worst part is that it's spreading. Every person it takes, every victim that dies with that look of confusion on their face, they add something to it. Feed it, make it stronger. And in places where winter lasts 6 months and temperatures drop to 70 below, there are always people desperate enough to make the same choice that miner made in 1923. So here's my advice. If you're planning to spend time in the real wilderness, never go alone, never go unprepared. And if you're ever in a situation where you have to choose between starving and eating something you shouldn't, choose starvation. Trust me, whatever happens to you will be better than what happens to the people you meet afterward. My name is Thomas Mackenzie. I used to be a park ranger, and I'm telling you this story because I want you to understand something important. The bout aren't the ones we need to worry about. The monsters we become. My name is Elena Petrov, and I've been a park ranger for 13 years. Before that nightmare in September 1985, I thought I knew everything about the wildlife in Katmai National Park. I had a PhD in marine biology, spoke 3 languages, and had published papers on Kodiak bear behavior. The Alutiiq elders who lived near the park always warned visitors about the Kushtaka, otter spirits that could take human form. I figured these were just old stories meant to keep people away from dangerous waters. I was wrong about a lot of things. The morning everything started, our radio crackled to life. A documentary film crew had gone missing somewhere along the southern coastline of Kodiak Island. 3 men had been filming salmon runs for a nature show. Their last radio contact was 2 days ago. "Elena, you know that area better than anyone," said my supervisor, Tom Bradley, through the static. "Coast Guard's sending a boat, but they need someone who understands the terrain." I grabbed my gear and headed for the dock. September storms were starting early that year, and fog banks rolled in thick as soup. The waters around Kodiak Island could turn deadly fast. I'd seen experienced fishermen get lost in weather like this. The Coast Guard cutter, Sentinel, was waiting when I arrived. Captain Williams introduced me to the rescue swimmer who'd be helping with the search, a young Alutiiq man named David Crow. He had the kind of calm confidence that comes from growing up on these waters. "My grandmother lives in the village nearest their last known position," David told me as we headed out. "She said something felt wrong about the water this week. Fish aren't running where they should be." I nodded, but didn't think much of it. Weather patterns could mess with salmon migrations. As a scientist, I looked for logical explanations. The boat ride took 3 hours through increasingly rough seas. When we reached the area where the film crew had been working, I immediately noticed something odd. The salmon stream that should have been thick with fish was nearly empty. In 13 years of studying these waters, I'd never seen anything like it. We found their boat first, anchored in a small cove near an old Russian Orthodox church. The structure dated back to the 1800s, when fur traders had a settlement here. Most of the buildings were long gone, but the church still stood, its wooden walls weathered grey by decades of salt spray. The film crew's equipment was scattered along the beach. Their underwater cameras had been pulled from the water and stacked in neat piles. Too neat. The metal housings showed deep scratches that didn't look like they came from bears or any animal I knew. "Elena," David called from near the tide pools. "Look at this." He was crouching next to a set of tracks in the wet sand. They started as normal sea otter prints, webbed feet about 4 inches long. But halfway across the beach they changed. The webbing disappeared, and what remained looked disturbingly like human handprints. "Tides must have washed away part of the tracks," I said, though my voice sounded uncertain even to me. David studied the prints more carefully. "My grandmother would say these are Kushtaka tracks, otter spirits that walk on 2 legs when they hunt." I wanted to dismiss this as folklore, but something about those tracks made my skin crawl. They were too deliberate, too organized, and they led directly toward the old church. We followed them up the rocky beach. The fog was getting thicker, and strange sounds echoed from the water behind us, chittering calls that didn't quite sound like normal otter communication. When I turned to look, I saw dark shapes moving just beneath the surface, too large to be the otters I was familiar with. The church door hung open, creaking in the wind. Inside, we found signs that the film crew had taken shelter here. Sleeping bags, food containers, and filming equipment were arranged around what had once been the altar. But there was no sign of the 3 men. David picked up a camera and checked the film. "Last shots were taken yesterday morning," he said. "They were filming something in the water." We heard voices calling from outside. Human voices, but muffled and strange. We rushed out of the church and saw a man standing on a sea stack about 100 yards offshore, waving frantically. "Jake Morrison!" I shouted, recognizing the documentary filmmaker from his publicity photos. "We're coming!" Ballard, but as we got closer to the water's edge, something felt wrong. The voices were coming from multiple directions now, not just from Morrison on the rock, but from the water itself. They sounded like the missing crew members calling for help, but the words echoed in ways that made no sense. David grabbed my arm. "Don't go in the water," he said quietly. "Those aren't the right voices." The rescue took 40 minutes. David proved to be an expert swimmer, and we managed to get Morrison back to shore using a rope and flotation device. But the man we pulled from that sea stack wasn't the confident filmmaker I'd seen in interviews. Jake Morrison was 34 years old, an experienced outdoorsman who'd filmed wildlife documentaries around the world. Now he sat shivering on the beach, wrapped in emergency blankets, his eyes darting constantly toward the water. "They're still out there," he kept saying. "They took Carl and Mike." I tried to get him to focus. "When did you last see your crew members?" Morrison took a shaky breath. "Yesterday morning. We were filming the salmon run, but there were hardly any fish. Carl noticed something moving underwater, too big to be salmon. He put on diving gear to get a closer look." He paused, staring at the dark water. The fog had lifted slightly, and I could see shapes moving beneath the surface. They looked like otters, but they were much larger than normal. "What happened next?" David prompted gently. "Carl started screaming underwater. When Mike pulled him up, Carl was babbling about otters with human hands. He said they were arranging something on the bottom, bones or rocks in patterns. Mike thought Carl had nitrogen narcosis, but—" Morrison's voice trailed off. In the distance, we could hear that strange chittering again, but now it sounded almost like laughter. "We decided to move to a safer location," Morrison continued. "But when we got back to shore, they were waiting for us. The otters. Except they weren't just otters anymore." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September air. "What do you mean?" Powerless. They were standing upright, walking like people but still shaped like otters, and they were talking. Morrison's voice dropped to a whisper. They were using Carl's voice, calling to Mike, asking him to come closer to the water. Sebastian and I exchanged glances. Every rational part of my mind wanted to dismiss this as hypothermia-induced hallucinations, but the evidence was mounting. The strange tracks, the missing crew, the unnatural behavior of local wildlife. "Mike didn't believe it at first," Morrison went on. "He thought Carl was playing some kind of joke. He walked right up to the water's edge. That's when they grabbed him." I asked. "The things that looked like otters. They had human hands instead of paws, and they moved faster than anything should move in water. Mike went under, and I heard him scream once. Then nothing." Plunged. The sun was starting to set, and the temperature was dropping fast. We needed to get Morrison back to the boat, but I wanted to search for his crew members. David suggested we wait until morning, but something told me we didn't have that long. "Bibliography. We have to find them tonight," I said, "if they're still alive." Morrison grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "They're not alive, not anymore. I saw what those things did to Carl." He pointed toward a cluster of sea caves about 200 yards down the beach. The tide was going out, which meant we could probably access caves that were normally underwater. "That's where they took him," Morrison said. I could hear him calling for help, but his voice got fainter and fainter. By the time I found a way down to the caves, the sound had stopped. David checked his equipment, waterproof flashlights, rope, emergency flares. "If we're going to do this, we need to be smart about it. These caves flood fast when the tide turns." We made our way across the rocky shoreline as darkness fell. The sounds from the water were getting louder. Not just otter chatter now, but something that sounded disturbingly like human conversation. I couldn't make out words, but the rhythm and cadence were unmistakably human speech. The entrance to the sea caves was larger than I'd expected, easily big enough for a person to walk through. David's flashlight beam revealed a tunnel that extended back into the rock for at least 50 feet. The walls were smooth, carved by centuries of tidal action. "Stay close," I told Morrison, "and if we tell you to run, you run. Don't look back." 20 feet into the cave, we found the first body. Carl Hendricks floated face down in a shallow pool, his diving equipment still intact. But something was wrong with the way he was positioned. His arms and legs were arranged in a deliberate pattern, almost ritualistic. David waded into the pool to check for signs of life, though it was clearly too late. When he turned the body over, we all saw it at the same time. Carl's eyes were gone, but not removed violently. The sockets were clean, as if they'd been carefully extracted. "Jesus," Morrison whispered. "What could do that?" Before anyone could answer, we heard Mike's voice echoing from deeper in the cave system. He was calling for help, but something about the sound was wrong. The acoustics were off, as if the voice was coming from underwater. David held up a hand for silence. We listened carefully, and that's when I realized the horrible truth. The voice was perfectly clear, with no signs of panic or injury. Mike was calling for help in the exact same words, repeated over and over like a recording. "Help me! I'm trapped back here! Can anyone hear me? Help me! I'm trapped back here!" The phrase never varied, never got louder or softer. It was like something was playing Mike's voice back to lure us deeper into the caves. "We're leaving," I said, "now." But as we turned to go, dark shapes moved across the cave entrance, blocking our exit. In the flashlight beam, I saw them clearly for the first time. They had the sleek bodies and thick fur of sea otters, but they stood on their hind legs like humans. Their front paws had been replaced by human hands, pale, with long fingers that ended in sharp claws. Most of all were their faces. They weren't quite otter, and weren't quite human. They had the elongated snouts and small ears of otters, but their eyes were unmistakably human, and they were smiling with human lips. "Hello, Elena," one of them said in Mike's voice. "We've been waiting for you." The creatures didn't attack immediately. They stood at the cave entrance, watching us with those horrible human eyes, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. There were 5 of them, each about the size of a large dog, but standing upright like children playing dress-up. "You can't be real," Morrison whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. The largest of the creatures, the one who'd spoken in Mike's voice, stepped forward. Water dripped from its fur, and I noticed that its breathing didn't fog in the cold air like ours did. "We are more real than you know," it said, switching to Carl's voice mid-sentence. "We have been here longer than your kind has walked this land." I forced myself to think like a scientist, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. These things were intelligent, organized, and they seemed to know who we were. That suggested they'd been watching us, possibly since we arrived. "What do you want?" I asked. And for a moment its face looked completely human, Mike's face, twisted with fear and pain. "We want what was taken from us. Life, breath, the warmth of blood in veins." Pedestrians had been slowly moving sideways, trying to find another exit from the cave. Now he spoke up. "You're Kushtaka. My grandmother told me stories." "Stories?" the creature laughed, a sound like water gurgling down a drain. "Your grandmother knew the truth that others have forgotten. We are the spirits of those who drowned in these waters. Russian traders, Alutiiq fishermen, sailors from many lands. The sea claimed our bodies, but our souls were trapped between worlds." It gestured toward the body floating in the pool. This one fought well, he had strong will, but the cold water always wins in the end. I was trying to remember everything I'd read about Kushtaka legends. They were shapeshifters, but they weren't purely evil. They sometimes saved drowning people, transforming them into otters to preserve their lives. But these creatures felt different, hungry and malicious. "The stories say you help lost travelers," I said carefully. "We help them find their way to us," another creature replied in a voice I didn't recognize. "We save them from the pain of drowning by taking that pain ourselves. They become part of our pack." Made a choking sound. "That's what happened to Mike and Carl? You turned them into us," the first creature finished. "They swim with us now, hunt with us. Soon you will join them." Temperature in the cave was dropping rapidly. Ice was forming on the walls, and our breath came out in thick clouds. The creatures seemed to grow larger and more solid as the cold increased. David suddenly grabbed my arm. "The tide," he whispered urgently. "It's turning." I could hear it now, water rushing into the cave system from multiple directions. We had maybe 10 minutes before this entire area would be underwater. The creatures knew it too. They were positioning themselves to drive us deeper into the caves, away from any possible escape. "Elena," one of them said, and this time it used my own voice, recorded somehow from when I'd been talking earlier. "You study us. You understand us. Join us willingly, and we will make your transformation painless." The water was rising fast now, already up to my knees. In the distance, I could hear Mike's voice still calling for help, but now it sounded like it was coming from all directions at once. I remembered something my grandmother had told me about Russian Orthodox traditions in Alaska. She'd been raised in a fishing family, and they had specific rituals for protecting themselves from sea spirits. Reaching into my jacket, I pulled out the small silver cross I'd worn since childhood. It had belonged to my great-grandmother, who'd immigrated from Russia in the 1920s. The effect was immediate. The creatures hissed and backed away from the silver, their human hands covering their faces. The largest ones snarled, showing teeth that were far too sharp for an otter. "That won't protect you for long," it said, its voice shifting between Mike's and Carl's. "The water rises. Soon you'll have to choose, drown as humans or live as we do." David was checking the cave walls, looking for handholds we could use to climb above the waterline. "There," he pointed to a narrow ledge about 8 feet up. "We can make it if we move now." Blackjack. But as we started to climb, the creatures began to change. Their otter forms dissolved like smoke, and they became something else. Dark, flowing shapes that moved through the water with impossible speed. They could control the currents, directing the rising tide to flow faster, making the water deeper than it should be. Morrison slipped on the wet rock and fell back into the water. Immediately, the creatures surrounded him. They didn't attack with claws or teeth. Instead, they simply touched him, and he began to change. His skin grew pale and thick, his fingers stretched and webbed. His eyes went wide with terror as he realized what was happening, but he couldn't speak anymore, only make chittering otter sounds. "But Atlanta," he managed to say in a voice that was no longer quite human. "Help me!" But there was nothing I could do. The transformation was complete within seconds. Morrison, or the thing that had been Morrison, looked up at me with otter eyes that still held human intelligence and pain. The water was up to the ledge now. David and I had nowhere left to climb. The creatures circled below us, waiting. They had all the time in the world. That's when I heard the sound of an outboard motor. The Coast Guard cutter, Sentinel, had followed our distress beacon. Captain Williams and his crew arrived just as the tide reached its peak, but they couldn't get close to the caves in the large boat. They brought inflatable rafts and diving equipment. "Elena!" Williams shouted through a megaphone. "Where are you?" Unresolved, I tried to answer, but the sound that came out of my mouth wasn't quite right. The cold water and fear had affected my voice, making it sound distorted and strange. For a horrifying moment, I wondered if I was already beginning to change like Morrison had. The creatures below us had vanished the moment they heard the motor. The water level dropped rapidly, much faster than any natural tide should recede. Within minutes, we could see the cave floor again, littered with bones and debris from decades of shipwrecks. David and I climbed down carefully. Morrison was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear otter chatter coming from the deeper cave systems. Somewhere in that maze of tunnels, the thing that had been Jake Morrison was learning to hunt with its new pack. "The bodies," David said quietly. "We need to find Mike and Carl before the rescue team gets here." We made our way deeper into the cave, following a trail of bones that had been arranged in deliberate patterns. The Kushtakar weren't just killing people, they were performing some kind of ritual, collecting souls to build their strength. We found Mike Brennan in a chamber about 100 feet from the entrance. Like Carl, his body had been positioned carefully, arms and legs spread in a specific pattern. But Mike was still alive. He was a pool of ice-cold seawater, his diving equipment keeping him breathing, but his body temperature was dangerously low. His lips were blue, and his eyes had the glassy look of severe hypothermia. "Mike?" I called softly. "Can you hear me?" His eyes focused on me with effort. They're trying to break me down," he whispered, "making me cold. So cold I want to become like them just to feel warm again." David immediately began first aid procedures while I checked Mike for injuries. Physically, he seemed unharmed, but there was something wrong with his energy, his life force. He felt diminished, as if part of his soul had already been drained away. "How long have you been here?" I asked. "Maybe days. Hard to tell. They keep showing me Carl. He looks happy now. Says the cold doesn't hurt anymore when you stop being human." The sound of boots echoed through the cave as the Coast Guard team reached us. But as they got closer, I heard something else. Otter vocalizations that sounded almost like human speech. "We need to get out of here," I told the rescue team leader. "This place isn't safe." But Captain Williams wanted to search the entire cave system. "We have reports of 3 missing persons. We're not leaving until we account for everyone." I tried to explain what we'd encountered, but it sounded insane even to me. Shape-shifting otter spirits? Ancient Alutiiq legends come to life? Williams listened politely but clearly thought I was suffering from stress and hypothermia. That's when the Kushtaka made their move. The water in the cave began to rise again, but this time it wasn't following any natural pattern. It flowed upward against gravity, forming spirals and whirlpools in mid-air. The creatures emerged from the water, but now they looked different, larger, more powerful, with features that shifted constantly between human and otter. The Coast Guard team opened fire, but bullets passed right through the creatures without effect. They weren't entirely physical anymore. They were something between spirit and flesh, held together by will and rage, and the accumulated cold of a century's worth of drowning victims. "The cross!" David shouted to me. "Use the cross!" I held up my grandmother's silver crucifix, and again the creatures recoiled. But this time they didn't retreat. Instead, they began to speak in unison, using the voices of everyone who'd ever drowned in these waters. "You cannot save them all," they said in a chorus of the dead. "The sea claims what it wants. Join us willingly, and we will let the others live." Williams were backing Dushtaka had surrounded us. The only way out was through them, and they weren't going to let that happen easily. The one who'd first spoken in Mike's voice stepped forward. Its form was more solid now, more defined. I could see that it had once been human, probably one of the Russian traders from the 1800s settlement. "You wear the symbol of the priests who came to our land," it said. "They promised salvation, but brought only death. Your God did not save us from drowning. Why do you think he will save you?" I thought about my great-grandmother's stories, about the faith that had sustained her through the journey from Russia to Alaska. She'd believed that some symbols held power, not because of what they were, but because of what they represented, the human refusal to surrender to despair. "Maybe my God can't save me from drowning," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. "But he can save me from becoming something like you." A creature's uncertainty in the sound. "You would choose death over transformation?" "Every time." That's when I understood what the Kushtaka really were. They weren't evil spirits. They were people who'd given up hope in their final moments. They'd chosen survival over everything else, even their humanity. They were trying to save us the only way they knew how, by making us like them. But some things were worse than death. I grabbed Mike and started pulling him toward the cave entrance. The Kushtaka could have stopped me easily, but they hesitated. My willingness to face death rather than join them had confused them, disrupted their certainty. David and the Coast Guard team followed, half carrying Mike between them. The creatures watched us go, their expressions unreadable. At the cave mouth, I turned back one last time. Morrison was there, still in otter form but standing upright. His eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw the man he'd been, confused, frightened, but somehow still himself. "I'm sorry," I whispered. He chittered once, a sound that might have been forgiveness or farewell, then disappeared into the dark water. The official report listed the incident as a tragic accident. Carl Hendricks and Jake Morrison had drowned when storm surges flooded the sea caves where they'd taken shelter. Mike Brennan survived, but suffered severe hypothermia and memory loss. He recovered physically, but never made another documentary. No one mentioned shape-shifting otter spirits in the paperwork. Marine biology, 3 months later, and transferred to forest ranger work inland. I told myself it was time for a career change, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't look at the ocean anymore without thinking about what lived beneath the waves. David Crow went back to his village, the Gelining of the Worgs, with a surf of confidence, and never talked about what we'd seen. But his grandmother wasn't surprised when I visited her the following spring. She served me tea and listened to my story without interruption. "The Kushta aren't evil," she said when I finished. "They're afraid. They were people once, and they remember what it felt like to drown. They think they're helping by bringing others into their pack. How do I live with knowing they're still out there?" "Sluggish," she smiled sadly. "The same way we've always lived with them. We remember the stories, we respect the water, and we teach our children to never ignore the warnings." I cross, but I also learned traditional Alutiiq protection prayers. Some knowledge is too important to trust to just one tradition. The disappearances around Kodiak Island didn't stop. Every few years, fishermen or tourists would vanish during storm season. The Coast Guard would search, but they never found bodies. The official explanations always involved rip currents and hypothermia. I knew better. I was working in Denali when I got a call from Captain Williams. A fishing boat had gone missing near the old Russian settlement. 3 men, last seen heading for shelter in the sea caves. The description sounded horribly familiar. "We found their boat," Williams told me, "anchored in the same cove where you found that film crew. Their equipment was stacked on the beach in neat piles. And Elena, there were tracks in the sand. The same kind of tracks you described in your report." I didn't go back. I'd learned my lesson. I'd had no my business in the fishing. It didn't go back. I welt me. The testingly, I still to make the memories of the cove. The Captain Williams could have found the film crew. Crossing the quarter required, they were found of the world. I didn't go back. I'd learned my lesson, that she was been very trauted, and realize, and a flexion self of the trumble. They were found is more of the trop, which may be contrue, and into anything serves. I don't understand they were the truth, then they work it. I didn't go back. We've never seen that the Coast Guard would left to the cove, but it wasn't thinks the boat, and they were searchly report. The crosses the Captain Williams could not shore, but they could trues from the truth. The required that they were wilkit the memory, and then they was search, design the world. I didn't go back. I'd never found that. The gather is the tracks, is work. They would learned. I'd learned my lesson about fighting things that couldn't be killed, or captured, or reasoned with. But I did make some phone calls. I made sure the local Alutiiq community knew what had happened. They would pass the word, share the warnings, keep the stories alive. But deal with the Kushtaka, not with guns or science or government reports, but with memory and respect, and the understanding that some parts of the natural world operate by rules we can't change. The pack is still out there, in the cold waters around Kodiak Island. They're still trying to save people the only way they know how. And sometimes, on foggy September nights, when the salmon runs are thin, you can still hear them calling from the sea caves. They use familiar voices. They promise warmth and safety and an end to fear. Listen. Don't go near the water. And never, ever ignore the stories the elders tell. Some warnings are written in blood and salt water. Those are the ones you can't afford to forget. My name is Elena Petrov, and I've spent 30 years trying to forget what I saw in those caves. But forgetting would be a betrayal of everyone who didn't make it out. So I remember. I tell the story. And I hope that somewhere, Jake Morrison found peace. He found it with webbed hands and otter eyes, swimming in the dark currents beneath Kodiak Island, still trying to help others the only way he could. The pack endures. The warnings remain. To them. My name is Gabriel Stonecrow, and I've been a ranger at Wrangell St. Elias National Park for 21 years. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything these mountains could throw at me. I was wrong. It was March 15th, 1982, and I was heading up to Mount Blackburn for a routine avalanche survey. Spring was coming, which meant the snowpack was getting dangerous. My job was to check the upper slopes and set off controlled slides before they could kill someone. Grown up hearing my grandmother's spirits that nested in the highest peaks. She said they could make the mountains scream with their voices. As a kid, those stories kept me awake at night. As a man, I knew better. Thunder was just air pressure. Screaming rocks were just ice cracking. The old legends were just ways to explain things people didn't understand yet. While helping helicopter drop me off at base camp, 12,000 feet up the mountain, the pilot, Jake Morrison, was supposed to pick me up in 3 days. Weather's looking rough, he said, checking his instruments. Might be some electromagnetic stuff moving in. Radio might get wonky. I'll be fine, I told him. Done this 100 times. Jake nodded, but he looked worried. Your ancestors ever tell stories about this mountain? I shrugged. Just old legends, nothing real. After he left, I set up my tent and checked my equipment. I had everything I needed: avalanche charges, radio, emergency beacon, climbing gear, and enough food for 5 days. The weather was cold but clear, perfect conditions for the work ahead. First night, I noticed the animals were acting strange. Usually, you'd see ptarmigan and maybe a few mountain goats at this elevation. But there was nothing. No birds, no tracks, no droppings. It was like every living thing had just disappeared. I told myself it was the weather. Animals could sense storms coming before we could. They'd probably moved to lower ground. But lying in my tent that night, I kept thinking about what Jake had said, and about my grandmother's stories. She used to tell me that the thunderbirds only came out when the mountain was angry, when something was wrong. Up around 3 a.m. to complete silence. No wind. No ice settling. Nothing. In 21 years on these mountains, I'd never heard quiet like that. It felt like the whole mountain was holding its breath. I stepped outside to check the weather. The stars were bright, but there was something weird about them. They seemed to be flickering in patterns like they were sending signals. And the air felt thick, like right before a thunderstorm, even though there wasn't a cloud in the sky. That's when I heard it for the first time. A low, humming sound, so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it with my ears. It seemed to be coming from inside the mountain. I grabbed my flashlight and looked around, but there was nothing to see. Just snow and rock, and the dark shapes of higher peaks against the stars. The humming stopped after about a minute, and the normal mountain sounds came back. Wind, settling ice, the crack of cooling rock. Went back to bed, but I didn't sleep well. I kept thinking about that sound, and about the missing animals, and about the way the stars had looked. The morning, everything seemed normal again. The sun was bright, the air was crisp and clean, and I could see for miles in every direction. I made coffee and planned my route for the day. I'd start with the western slopes, where the snow looked deepest. As I packed my gear, I found myself humming that same deep tune I'd heard in the night. I stopped when I realized what I was doing. Where had that melody come from? The climb up to the western slopes took most of the morning. The snow was deep and powdery, exactly the kind that made deadly avalanches. I'd need to be careful where I placed my charges. I was about 500 feet up from base camp when I found the first set of tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of my boots, and shaped wrong. Too wide at the toes, with what looked like claw marks extending past where the foot ended. But the strangest thing was how deep they were. Whatever made these tracks had to weigh at least 800 pounds, but the snow around them wasn't compressed the way it should be. It was like something incredibly heavy had barely touched the ground. I followed the tracks for about 100 yards. They led straight up the slope, over rocks and ice falls that would be impossible for any normal animal to climb. Then they just stopped. No sign of where whatever made them had gone. They just ended in the middle of a flat patch of snow. Payback, I took pictures with my camera and made notes. Could be some kind of bear, though I'd never seen bear tracks that big. And it was way too early in the season for bears to be this high up. I tried to radio back to headquarters, but I was getting nothing but static. Jake had warned me about electromagnetic interference, so I wasn't too worried yet. I'd try again from higher up. I spent the afternoon setting charges on the most dangerous-looking snow formations. The work was routine. Drill a hole, place the explosive, run the wire back to a safe distance, and detonate. Each controlled slide would make the mountain a little safer for the summer climbing season. But every time I set off a charge, I heard something else mixed in with the rumble of falling snow. That same deep humming I'd heard the night before. It was like the mountain was answering back. As the sun started to set, I headed back toward base camp. That's when I saw the second set of tracks. These were different, smaller, but there were dozens of them, all moving in the same direction. They looked almost like human footprints, but the toes were too long, and they had the same claw marks as the big ones. Both sets of tracks were heading toward my camp. I picked up my pace, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The shadows were getting long, and every rock and ice formation looked like it might be hiding something. The temperature was dropping fast, and my breath came out in thick puffs that seemed to hang in the air longer than they should. When I got back to camp, my tent had been moved. Not destroyed or scattered, just moved. It was sitting about 50 feet from where I'd left it, perfectly set up, with all my gear neatly arranged inside. But I knew I hadn't moved it. I remembered exactly where I'd pitched it, next to a distinctive rock formation for wind protection. I stood there for a long time, trying to figure out what could have happened. Maybe the wind. But there hadn't been any wind all day, and besides, wind would have scattered my stuff, not carefully relocated it. I checked my equipment. Nothing was missing, but everything felt different, like someone had been handling it. My sleeping bag was warmer than it should be, as if something had been lying in it. My water bottles had ice crystals on them that formed strange, almost deliberate patterns. That night I barely slept. Everything that was released, if might for its bird. Every bottle's weltered being groat. Around midnight, I heard footsteps circling my tent. Slow, deliberate steps that crunched in the snow. But when I looked outside, there was nothing there. Just my own tracks from earlier. A humming started again. This time it was louder, and it seemed to be coming from multiple directions at once. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap. When I saw them, lights in the sky, but not like any aircraft I'd ever seen. They moved in perfect formation, diving and climbing around the mountain peaks like they were dancing. Sometimes they'd disappear behind a ridge and then emerge somewhere completely different, like they'd passed through solid rock. The lights were bright white with blue edges, and they cast shadows that moved independently of the lights themselves. I watched for maybe 10 minutes, taking pictures, though I wasn't sure if the camera could capture what I was seeing. Then, all at once, the lights went out. The humming stopped, and in the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Singing. High-pitched, almost like a flute, but with harmonies that sounded like human voices. It was coming from the peak above me, Mount Blackburn's summit, still 4,000 feet up. The melody was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, and it seemed to be calling to something. That's when I remembered the rest of my grandmother's stories. She'd said the thunderbirds didn't just live in the mountains, they were the mountains. And when they sang, it meant they were hunting. I didn't sleep at all that second night. As soon as the sun came up, I tried the radio again. Still nothing but static. But now the static seemed to have patterns in it, almost like voices talking just too quietly to understand. I had a decision to make. The smart thing would be to pack up and hike down to the pickup point, wait for Jake to come get me a day early. But I had a job to do, and I'd never left a mission unfinished in 21 years. Besides, I kept telling myself there had to be rational explanations for everything I'd seen. The tracks could be from some kind of mutant bear. The moved tent could have been wind I didn't notice. The lights could have been some kind of military testing. They did that sometimes in Alaska. And the singing, well, wind through ice formations could make all kinds of weird noises. I decided to finish the avalanche survey, but to work faster. If I could complete the job today, I could hike down tomorrow and meet Jake at the original pickup time. I was packing my gear when I found the first gift. It was sitting on top of my backpack, a piece of ice carved into a perfect spiral, about the size of my fist. The carving was incredibly detailed, with tiny patterns that seemed to move when I looked at them from different angles. It was beautiful, but it also made me feel sick to look at it for too long. There was no way this was natural. Someone or something had made it and left it for me. But who? And how had they gotten into my camp without waking me? I left the ice carving and started climbing toward the upper slopes. Today, I needed to check the north face, where the really dangerous snow formations were. It was steeper and more technical climbing, but it was also where most of the climbing accidents happened. About halfway up, I found Jake Morrison. He was hanging upside down from a cliff face, about 200 feet above the trail. His helicopter was nowhere to be seen. He was still alive, but barely conscious, and his legs were bent at angles that made my stomach turn. "Jake!" I shouted. "What happened? How did you get up there?" He looked down at me with eyes that didn't quite focus. "They came for me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Said you called for help. Said you were dying." "I didn't call for help. My radio's been dead since yesterday." "I know that now." Jake coughed, and blood came out. "But the voice on the radio, it sounded exactly like you. Even knew things only you would know. About your grandmother's stories, about the Thunderbirds." I felt cold that had nothing to do with the weather. "Where's your helicopter?" "They took it apart," Jake said, piece by piece, while I watched, like they were studying it. He closed his eyes. "Gabriel, they're not legends. They're real. And they're angry about something." I climbed up to where Jake was hanging and cut him down as gently as I could. He was hurt bad, internal injuries, broken bones, hypothermia. Without medical attention, he'd be dead in hours. But as I was checking his injuries, I noticed something that made me stop breathing. There were marks on his jacket, long scratches that went through the heavy material like it was paper. The scratches were in groups of 4, and they were exactly the same size as the claw marks I'd seen in the snow. "Jake, what did they look like?" He grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Big," he whispered. "Bigger than anything should be. But they moved like birds, like they were flying even when they were walking on the ground. And their faces," he shuddered. "They looked almost human, but wrong, like someone tried to make a person but only had pictures to work from." That's when we heard the singing again. This time it was coming from multiple directions, and it was getting closer. The melodies wove together in harmonies that hurt to listen to, like the sound was bypassing my ears and going directly into my brain. "They're coming back," Jake said. "They always come back when someone sings with them." "What do you mean, when someone sings with them?" Jake looked at me with eyes full of fear. "You've been humming their song, haven't you? Since the first night? You can't help it. Once you hear it, it gets stuck in your head. That's how they mark their prey." I've been humming that melody all morning without even knowing it. It was stuck in my head like a commercial jingle, playing over and over. The singing was getting louder, and now I could hear wing beats, huge, powerful sounds like someone shaking out enormous blankets. But there was nothing in the sky. "We need to get out of here," I said, helping Jake to his feet. "Can you walk?" "I'll try." We started down the mountain, but we didn't get far. After about 50 feet, Jake collapsed. He'd lost too much blood, and the cold was shutting down his body. "Leave me," he said. "They want you, not me. I was just bait." "I'm not leaving you." "Gabriel," Jake grabbed my hand. "Listen to me. Your grandmother's stories, they weren't just legends. They were warnings. The Thunderbirds are guardians, but they're also hunters. And something's upset them. Something's made them think humans are a threat." The wing beat directly overhead now, even though the sky was empty. The sound was so loud it made my teeth ache. And mixed in with the wing beats, I could hear voices, speaking in a language that sounded almost familiar, like words I'd heard in dreams. That's when the first one landed. It appeared suddenly, like it had been invisible, and then decided to let me see it. It was at least 12 feet tall, with wings that stretched 30 feet on each side. Its body was covered in feathers that shifted color as it moved, and its face was exactly what Jake had described, almost human, but assembled wrong. The eyes were too large and too bright, the nose was too sharp, and when it opened its mouth, I could see rows of teeth like broken glass. But the worst part was that I recognized it. This was the creature from my grandmother's stories, the one she'd drawn in the sand when I was 5 years old. Down to the last detail, this was exactly what she'd told me the Thunderbirds looked like. It looked at me with those huge, bright eyes, and when it spoke, its voice sounded exactly like mine. "Gabriel Stonecrow," it said, "we have been waiting for you to come home." The Thunderbird that spoke with my voice tilted its head, studying me like I was a puzzle it was trying to solve. "You do not remember us," it said, "but we remember you. We remember your grandmother. She made a promise." More Thunderbirds were landing around us. I counted at least 6, maybe more. They moved without sound, like they were floating just above the ground. Jake had passed out from blood loss, which was probably a mercy. "What promise?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "When the mountain spirits grew angry, when the earth began to bleed metal and fire, she promised that her blood would return to help heal the wounds. You are her blood, Gabriel Stonecrow. You are the one who will choose." Understand what it was talking about, but something deep in my memory was stirring. Fragments of conversations with my grandmother when I was very young, before my parents moved us to the city. Stories she'd told me about our family's special connection to these mountains. "Choose what?" I asked. The largest Thunderbird stepped forward. Its feathers were white and silver, and its eyes were the color of ice. When it moved, I could feel the temperature drop. "The miners will come," it said. "In 3 seasons, they will bring their machines to tear apart Mount Blackburn's heart. They seek the copper and gold that flows in its veins. If they are allowed to proceed, the mountain will die. And if the mountain dies, we die. And if we die, the sky itself will fall." I stared at the creature. "You're talking about the mining survey, the one planned for 1985. "Yes, your people call it progress. We call it murder." I'd heard rumors about a major mining operation being planned for this area. The geology was right for copper deposits, and with metal prices going up, it made economic sense. But I'd also heard the environmental groups were planning to fight it. "Why are you telling me this? I'm just a park ranger." "You are more than that," the Silver Thunderbird said. "Your grandmother was a bridge between our worlds. She spoke for us when no one else would listen. She taught your people to respect the old ways. And before she died, she promised that when the time came, her family would stand with us again." Another fragment of memory surfaced. My grandmother sick in her hospital bed, making me promise to remember the old stories and listen when the mountain speaks. I'd thought she was just talking about preserving our culture. I'd had no idea she meant this literally. "What do you want me to do?" "Use your position. Your voice carries weight with the government people. Speak against the mining. Help them understand what will be lost." I felt a surge of relief. This was something I could actually do. As a senior ranger with 2 decades of experience, my environmental impact reports did carry weight, and I was already opposed to the mining project on ecological grounds. "Okay," I said, "I'll do what I can. I'll fight the mining project." The Thunderbirds looked at each other, communicating in that high-pitched, singing language. Finally, the silver one turned back to me. "That is not enough," it said. "The government will not listen to words. They must see the consequences of their actions." "What do you mean?" "You will bring them here. The mining surveyors, the government officials, the investors. You will bring them to this mountain, and we will show them what we are, what they will lose, what will happen if they proceed." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "You want me to lure people up here? So you can do to them what you did to Jake?" Jake Morrison was not harmed by us. He was harmed by his own fear. We tried to communicate with him, to explain, but he could not see past his terror. "You are different. You remember the old ways, even if you do not know you remember them." I looked down at Jake's unconscious form, at the claw marks on his jacket, at his broken bones. "This doesn't look like communication to me." "He fell," the silver Thunderbird said simply. "When he saw us, he fell. We tried to catch him, but he fought against our help. Fear makes humans do foolish things." I didn't know whether to believe that or not, but I was starting to understand that these creatures weren't necessarily evil. They were desperate. They were facing extinction, and they were trying to protect the only home they'd ever known. "What if I can't convince them?" I asked. "What if I bring them here, and they still decide to mine the mountain?" The Thunderbird's eyes went completely black. "Then we will stop them ourselves, and the sky will be red with their blood." The temperature around us dropped another 10 degrees. Frost began forming on my jacket and gloves. The other Thunderbirds spread their wings and began that harmonic singing again, but now it sounded like a war chant. While realized I was at the center of a decision that would affect hundreds, maybe thousands of lives. If I helped the Thunderbirds, I'd be betraying my own species. If I didn't help them, they'd start a war they couldn't win, and a lot of innocent people would die. But there was a third option. "What if there was another way?" I said. "What if I could get the mining project cancelled without bringing anyone up here?" The silver Thunderbird studied me for a long moment. "How?" "I know people in the environmental movement, scientists, lawyers, politicians. If I can document what lives up here, if I can prove that this ecosystem is unique and irreplaceable, I might be able to get the mountain protected legally, turn it into a wilderness area where mining is prohibited." "You would do this?" "I'll try, but I need something from you in return." "What?" "Proof. Something I can show people that will make them understand how important this place is. And no more violence. No matter what happens, you don't hurt anyone else." The Thunderbirds conferred again in their singing language. The conversation went on for several minutes, with voices rising and falling in complex harmonies. Finally, the silver one turned back to me. "We will give you 1 season. If you succeed in protecting the mountain through your laws, we will disappear. We will find somewhere else to live, somewhere your people cannot reach us. But if you fail—" "I won't fail." "You had better not," the Thunderbird said, "because if you do, the blood of everyone who dies will be on your hands as well as ours." The Thunderbirds took Jake and me down the mountain in a way I still don't fully understand. One moment we were standing in the snow at 13,000 feet, and the next we were at the base camp, with Jake already loaded into his helicopter, which was sitting there undamaged and fully functional. "Sleep now," the silver Thunderbird said. "When you wake, this will feel like a dream, but you will remember your promise." I wanted to ask more questions to understand how they'd moved us, how Jake's helicopter had been repaired, how any of this was possible. But exhaustion hit me like a physical blow, and I was unconscious before I could say another word. I woke up 18 hours later to the sound of Jake's helicopter starting up. He was conscious, sitting in the pilot's seat, with no sign of the injuries I'd seen. When he saw me coming, he waved me over. "Time to go, Gabriel," he said. "Weather's turning bad." "Jake, do you remember what happened up there?" Hezbollah, he gave me a puzzled look. "What do you mean?" "Nothing happened. Routine pickup." Though I did have some weird dreams last night, something about giant birds. I looked back up at Mount Blackburn's peak. For just a moment, I thought I saw a flash of silver wings against the snow. But when I blinked, there was nothing there. The flight back to headquarters was quiet. Jake didn't remember any of it. The crash, the Thunderbirds, our conversation about the mining project. To him, it had all been a dream. Maybe that was better. But I remembered every word. As over the next 6 months, I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life. I documented every species of plant and animal in the Mount Blackburn area. I collected soil samples and water samples and took thousands of photographs. I wrote environmental impact reports that were so detailed they could be used as textbooks. More importantly, I reached out to every environmental group, every scientist, every politician who might be able to help. I testified at hearings, wrote letters to newspapers, and gave presentations to anyone who would listen. Prohibited I never mentioned the Thunderbirds. I didn't need to. The scientific case for protecting Mount Blackburn was strong enough on its own. The area was home to several endangered species, had unique geological formations, and served as a crucial watershed for 3 major river systems. The mining company fought back hard. They had money and political connections, and lawyers who could twist words into pretzels. But we had something they didn't. We had the truth. In December of 1982, Mount Blackburn and the surrounding 50,000 acres were designated as a protected wilderness area. Mining, logging, and motorized vehicles were permanently prohibited. I was there the day they announced the decision. As I stood in the government building, listening to the official proclamation, I felt a warm wind blow through the room, even though all the windows were closed, and for just a moment, I heard that high-pitched singing in harmonies that made my heart soar. They'd kept their promise. The Thunderbirds disappeared after that. No more sightings, no more mysterious tracks, no more midnight singing. They'd found somewhere else to live, somewhere humans couldn't reach them. At least that's what I told myself. But sometimes, on clear nights when I'm out on patrol in the mountains, I see lights dancing around the highest peaks. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I hear singing that sounds like freedom and wildness and ancient promises kept. And I still hum their melody, even though I try not to. It's stuck in my head forever now, a reminder of the choice I made and the responsibility I carry. Because I know the truth that most people will never know. We're not alone on this earth. We share it with beings that are older and wiser and more powerful than us. Most of the time, they leave us alone. But sometimes, when we threaten something they love, they fight back. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, they give us a chance to do the right thing. My grandmother would have been proud. My name is Gabriel Stonecrow, and I've been keeping the Thunderbirds secret for 43 years. I'm telling this story now because I'm old, and because the mining companies are coming back with new technology and new arguments. And because I want people to know, the mountains are watching, the sky is listening, and some promises can never be broken, even if it costs us everything. My name is Patricia Coldwater, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. Most people think Alaska is all snow and silence, but they're wrong. The land here talks to you if you know how to listen. My grandmother taught me that when I was little, back when she still told the old stories about things that lived in the ice. I work in Gates of the Arctic National Park, up in the Brooksits, January 1979, and we're deep in polar night. The sun hasn't shown its face in 2 months, and it won't for another month. Just endless dark, broken only by the northern lights dancing green and blue across the sky. Lingering here isn't like anywhere else. At -80 degrees, your breath freezes before it leaves your mouth. Your eyelashes turn to ice crystals, The snow crunches under your boots like broken glass. But I grew up with this cold. My family has hunted these lands for hundreds of years. The ice doesn't scare me. What scares me is when the ice changes. I was doing my monthly patrol of the Chandalar Lake system when I first noticed something wrong. I'd been out for 3 days, checking the remote weather stations and making sure no illegal hunters had wandered into the preserve. My snowmobile hummed beneath me as I followed the frozen shoreline, headlight cutting through the darkness. The lake should have been smooth. January ice gets thick and hard, like a giant mirror. But as my light swept across the surface, I saw cracks. Not normal stress cracks from temperature changes. These were different. They formed patterns. I stopped the machine and pulled out my flashlight. The beam revealed lines in the ice that looked almost like writing. Curved symbols that reminded me of something, though I couldn't place what. They stretched for maybe 20 feet across the lake surface. Profitability, I muttered, my voice muffled by the thick silence. I'd seen a lot of strange things in 16 years of ranger work. Ice does funny things sometimes. Pressure creates patterns. Wind carves shapes. There was probably a simple explanation. But my grandmother's voice whispered in the back of my mind. She used to tell stories about Tornasuk, the great bear spirit that lived beneath the ice. When the ice speaks in the old language, she'd say, wise people listen. I shook my head. Those were just stories, metaphors to teach survival skills and respect for the land. I was a park ranger, not a superstitious child. I documented the ice patterns with my camera and continued my patrol. The next weather station was 5 miles north, tucked into a valley between 2 ridges. Everything seemed normal until I reached the equipment shelter. The door was open. Those shelters were built to withstand hurricane-force winds. The latches were heavy-duty, designed never to open on their own. I approached carefully, radio ready in case I found illegal campers. Inside, the weather. Equipment was scattered across the floor. Not damaged, just rearranged. The temperature sensors had been placed in a circle. The wind measurement tools were stacked in a neat pyramid. Everything metal was positioned pointing toward the lake. Checked my records. The last maintenance visit was 6 weeks ago. No storms had been strong enough to cause this. And if someone had broken in, why arrange things so carefully instead of stealing them? My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Coldwater, this is base. You copy? Copy, base. Everything okay? Got a weird report from the aerial survey team. They flew over your sector yesterday and said the lake ice looked strange. Something about unusual formations. I thought about the symbols I'd found. What kind of formations? They couldn't get good photos in the darkness, but the pilot said it looked like something had been moving under the ice. Big movements. You seeing anything unusual out there? I looked back toward the lake, invisible in the darkness beyond my small circle of light. Just some stress cracks. I'll keep monitoring. Big storm system is moving in tomorrow. Might want to think about heading back early. Arbitrarily. Will do. Cold water out. Confiscated. But I wasn't ready to head back. Something was happening here. Something that didn't fit the normal patterns I'd learned in 16 years of Arctic work. The land was trying to tell me something. And my grandmother always said ignoring the land's messages was dangerous. I decided to make camp near the lake and do some night observation. If something was moving under the ice, maybe I could figure out what. Up my cold weather tent in the shelter of some snow-bent willows, I thought about those stories again. Tornasuk wasn't just a bear in the old tales. It was hunger itself, an ancient thing that had learned to survive in the coldest, darkest places. When food became scarce, when winter stretched too long, Tornasuk would wake. But that was just mythology, metaphor, the kind of stories people told to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand. At least, that's what I told myself as I crawled into my sleeping bag and tried not to listen to the sounds coming from beneath the ice. I woke to absolute silence. In the Arctic, silence is never good. There should always be something. Wind moving through ice formations, the settling of snow, the distant crack of thermal expansion. Complete silence means something is wrong. I checked my watch. 3 a.m. I'd been asleep for 4 hours and my body felt rested, but my mind was instantly alert. Ranger instincts. Through the tent wall, I could hear my own breathing and heartbeat. Nothing else. I unzipped the tent flap and looked out. The aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green fire, bright enough to see by. The lake stretched before me, a white expanse that looked peaceful and normal. Then I saw the holes. Perfect circles had opened in the ice, each about 6 feet across. They hadn't been there when I made camp. The edges looked smooth, not jagged like they'd been broken, more like they'd been melted from below. I grabbed my gear and approached the nearest hole cautiously. The ice around it was thick, at least 3 feet, enough to support a truck. Whatever had melted through this much ice generated serious heat. I pointed my flashlight down into the hole. The beam showed dark water maybe 10 feet below the surface, but something was wrong with the reflection. Instead of bouncing back normally, the light seemed to bend and twist, like the water was moving in impossible ways. A sound echoed up from the hole, a low rumble that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. It reminded me of a whale song, but deeper, hungrier. I moved to the next hole, same thing. Smooth edges, dark water, that strange rumbling from far below. But at this hole, I noticed something else. Scratch marks in the ice around the opening. 4 parallel grooves, each as wide as my thumb, carved deep into the frozen surface. Claw marks. But what kind of animal had claws that big? The rumbling grew louder, coming from all 7 holes at once, a harmony of hungry sounds that made my teeth ache. I backed away from the lake edge, every instinct telling me to run. But I'm a park ranger. Running isn't what we do. I pulled out my radio. "Base, this is Coldwater. Emergency traffic." Submerged static answered me. I tried again. Nothing but white noise. The radio had worked fine 6 hours ago. I checked the battery. Full charge. Antenna was intact. But something was interfering with the signal. The rumbling stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard a new sound. Splash. Something large moving in the water below. Then another splash from a different hole. And another. Something was moving from hole to hole beneath the ice. Multiple somethings. I started backing toward my snowmobile, keeping my light trained on the holes. The aurora light was fading, leaving me with just the narrow beam of my flashlight and the growing certainty that I was not alone on this lake. That's when I saw the eyes. 2 pale points of light, reflecting from the nearest hole. They weren't the bright reflection you get from normal animal eyes caught in a flashlight beam. These glowed with their own cold fire, like phosphorescence in deep ocean water. The eyes rose slowly from the hole, and I realized they were attached to something much larger than I'd imagined. A head emerged from the water, but calling it a head was like calling a hurricane a breeze. It was massive, covered in wet fur that looked black in my light, but might have been any color. The snout was elongated, filled with teeth that caught the aurora light like ivory daggers. But it was the intelligence in those eyes that froze my blood. This wasn't an animal driven by instinct. This thing was thinking, planning, watching me with the patience of something that had learned to hunt over centuries. I reached my snowmobile and tried to start it. The engine turned over but didn't catch. The cold was making everything sluggish, including my movements as fear began to take hold. The creature pulled itself further out of the hole, revealing shoulders that spanned the entire 6-foot opening. Water cascaded off its fur, steaming in the frigid air. It wasn't following normal physics. Nothing that large should be able to support itself on ice edges that should crumble under the weight. More eyes appeared at other holes. The pack was rising. My snowmobile finally roared to life. I didn't wait to count how many creatures were emerging. I gunned the engine and shot across the lake surface, racing for the far shore and the trail that led back toward civilization. Behind me, the silence broke with a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a roar, not quite a song, but something that combined the fury of a blizzard with the hunger of a predator that had been waiting too long for prey. The sound followed me across the ice, echoing off the mountains and seeming to come from everywhere at once. And underneath it, I heard something worse. Footsteps. Massive paws hitting ice with enough force to crack it. The pack was following me. I pushed the snowmobile faster than was safe in the darkness, using the aurora light and my headlamp to navigate between ice ridges and snowdrifts. Every few seconds I glanced back. Peacefully, they were keeping pace. 7 massive shapes moved across the ice behind me, running with a fluid grace that defied their size. In the shifting light, they looked like living shadows, dark fur rippling over muscles built for power and endurance. I reached the shore and shot up the trail toward high ground, hoping the rocky terrain would slow them down. The snowmobile's track bit into the snow, throwing up a rooster tail behind me. When I finally risked another look back, the lake was empty. The creatures had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. But the holes in the ice were still there, and somewhere in my pack, my camera held photos of scratch marks and impossible ice formations that no one would believe. Stiffness, Tornasuk, and it had seen me. Now I understood why my grandmother's stories always ended the same way. When the ice speaks, wise people listen. When Tornasuk wakes, even wise people run. I made it back to the ranger station by dawn, though dawn was just a slightly lighter shade of darkness in January. My hands were shaking as I filled out the incident report, and not from the cold. Parkinson's supervisor Bill Hendricks read my report twice before looking up at me. He was a good man, 20 years in the service, but he'd never worked this far north before his transfer from Colorado. "Patricia, I need you to think carefully about what you're telling me here. 7 large animals? Emerging from holes they melted in 3-foot-thick ice? Animals that kept pace with a snowmobile?" I know how it sounds. Do you? Because it sounds like someone spent too many nights alone in -80 weather. His voice was gentle but firm. Hypothermia can cause hallucinations. Exhaustion plays tricks on the mind. Pulled out my camera and showed him the photos, the ice patterns, the scratch marks, the perfectly round holes. Bill studied each image carefully. "These are interesting formations," he admitted. "But ice does strange things under pressure. And these marks," he pointed at the claw gouges, "could be from a bear. Black bear might have fallen through thin ice." "In January? At -80? Bill, bears are hibernating. And look at the size of these marks." "Large bear," he said, but his voice carried less conviction. "I'm going back out there, with backup this time. Weather winds up to 70 miles per hour, temperature dropping to -90. Nobody goes out in that." The storm hit that afternoon. I spent 3 days at the station, monitoring radio traffic and weather reports, while wind howled around the building like something alive and hungry. But the storm also brought something else. Reports. A bush pilot who'd been forced to land near Chandalar Lake when the weather turned. He'd waited out the worst of it in his plane, but on the second night, he'd seen lights moving under the ice. Not the aurora, he knew the difference. These were pale, cold lights that moved with purpose beneath the frozen surface. Like someone was walking around down there with flashlights, he told us over the radio. But that's impossible, right? The lake's frozen solid. Then came the hunters. 2 men from Fairbanks had been ice fishing at a smaller lake 20 miles south. They drilled holes for fishing and were settling in for the night when something began hitting the ice from below. Not like a fish bumping the surface, but like something large trying to break through. "It shook the whole lake," one of them reported. "Ice 3 feet thick, and whatever was down there was making it jump. We packed up and got out of there fast." The third report came from an Inupiat family who lived in a traditional hunting camp 40 miles east. Mary Kanguk called on her satellite radio, her voice tight with fear. "Something took our dogs," she said. "All 7 of them. During the storm. Found the chains snapped, not cut. Whatever did this was strong enough to break steel links. I knew Mary's family. They kept working dogs, huskies bred for strength and endurance. Those chains were rated to hold animals that could pull loaded sleds across hundreds of miles of tundra. "Did you see what took them?" I asked. "Tracks," Mary said, "in the snow around the dog yard, paw prints bigger than dinner plates." But here's the strange thing. The tracks led toward the creek, then just stopped. Like whatever made them went into the water. In this weather, Mary, that creek is frozen solid. That's what I thought too, but there's open water there now, a hole maybe 10 feet across, with the ice edges all smooth like they'd been melted. Possessing the pattern was becoming clear, and it was spreading. On the fourth day, the storm broke, and I convinced Bill to let me lead a small investigation team back to Chandler Lake. We took 2 snowmobiles and enough gear for 3 days. My partner was Jake Morrison, a young ranger fresh from the lower 48, who still thought Alaska was just a bigger version of Montana. We also brought weapons, standard Park Service sidearms plus a rifle, ostensibly for bears. I didn't tell Jake that normal ammunition probably wouldn't help us. The lake had changed. Where there had been 7 holes, now there were dozens. They formed a pattern across the ice, connected by what looked like travel routes, smooth channels where something had moved repeatedly between openings. The ice in these channels was different, darker, like it had been stained from below. Jake knelt by one of the holes and pointed his flashlight down. "Jesus, look at this." Unauthorized, and immediately wished I hadn't. The hole descended much deeper than it should have. Chandler Lake was only 30 feet deep, but this opening seemed to go down forever. And the walls, they weren't ice anymore. They looked organic, like the inside of a throat. "This isn't natural," Jake whispered. A sound echoed up from the depths, that same low rumble I'd heard before, but stronger now. It reverberated through the ice and into our bones. "We need to leave," I said, "now." But Jake was already moving to another hole, fascinated by what he was seeing. "Patricia, look at this. These formations. It's like something has been reshaping the lake from inside." That's when the ice began to crack. Not stress cracks from weight or temperature. These were purposeful breaks, lines spreading outward from the holes in geometric patterns. The cracks moved fast, racing across the surface with sharp, snapping sounds. "Get back to the snowmobiles!" I shouted. Congressional Jake finally understood the danger. We ran for our machines as the ice continued to fracture around us. But we weren't fast enough. A section of ice between us and our escape route simply collapsed, revealing open water that hadn't been there moments before. Dark water that moved in ways that defied physics, with currents that flowed upward and eddies that spun in impossible directions. Something large moved in that dark water. Multiple somethings. "The other side!" Jake yelled. "We can circle around!" But as we changed direction, more ice gave way. The lake was coming apart in a pattern, like something underneath was systematically destroying the surface. We found ourselves trapped on a shrinking island of ice, surrounded by black water and the growing certainty that this was exactly what something had planned. The water began to bubble and steam despite the sub-zero temperature, and from somewhere far below, pale lights started to rise toward the surface. That's when I saw them clearly for the first time. They weren't bears. They weren't anything that should exist in any world ruled by normal laws. They were massive, predatory things that might have once been bears, but had been changed by something older and hungrier than evolution. Their fur was white as ice, but moved like it was alive, flowing and shifting in patterns that hurt to watch. Their eyes burned with cold fire, and their mouths were full of too many teeth, all of them pointing inward like a shark's. When they were intelligent, I could see it in the way they coordinated their attack, surfacing from different points to cut off all escape routes. This wasn't animal behavior. This was strategy. The largest one emerged directly in front of us, water cascading off its impossible bulk. It stood upright in the black lake, showing us that it was at least 12 feet tall. When it opened its mouth, the sound that came out wasn't a roar. It was laughter. The creature spoke. Not in English, not in any human language, but I understood it anyway. The words bypassed my ears and went straight into my mind, carrying meanings that made my skull ache. Little daughter of the ice people, you carry the old blood. You should know better than to ignore the warnings. Jake was backing away from the water's edge, his face pale with shock. Patricia, did that thing just— Don't move, I whispered. Don't run. The massive creature's eyes fixed on me with ancient intelligence. Your grandmother told you the stories. Did she tell you the truth behind them? Suddenly I was 8 years old again, sitting in my grandmother's kitchen while she prepared seal meat and spoke of the old times. She told me about Tornasuk, but not like the simple stories most people knew. She told me the real version. You're not just spirits, I said aloud. You're what's left of the ancient ones, the first people who learned to survive in the ice. Learned, adapted, changed. The creature's mental voice carried amusement and terrible sadness. When the world grew cold and the ice covered everything, when normal flesh could no longer survive, we chose to become something that could. We made bargains with the hunger itself. Jake was staring at me. Patricia, what are you doing? We need to get out of here. But I finally understood. These weren't monsters that had invaded our world. They were what remained of people who had lived here long before the Ice Age ended. People who had made the ultimate sacrifice to survive the endless winter. You've been sleeping, I said, waiting beneath the ice. But something woke you up. The world grows cold again. The ice speaks of changes coming. Soon, the normal ones will need what we have learned. Soon, they will need to choose, change or die. The creature moved closer, water barely rippling around its massive form. You carry the old blood, little daughter. You could choose differently than the others. What are you talking about? Melancus. Become what your ancestors were meant to be. When the cold comes again, you will survive while others freeze. I felt the offer like a physical thing, a presence in my mind showing me visions. I saw myself changed, transformed into something that could walk across the Arctic ice without cold weather gear, that could hunt and survive in conditions that would kill normal humans in minutes. I saw a future where the Ice Age returned, and only the adapted ones lived to see the world that came after. But I also saw the hunger, the need to feed on those who couldn't change, the ancient loneliness of being the only survivors in an empty world. No, I said. The creature's expression shifted to something like disappointment. Then you will warn the others. Tell them the ice wakes. Tell them to prepare for the choice that comes. Jake grabbed my arm. Patricia, the ice, look. Becca. Our small island of surface ice was breaking apart rapidly now. We had maybe minutes before we'd be in the black water, with creatures that had learned to hunt in conditions that would kill us instantly. But I had one advantage. 16 years of Arctic survival training, plus knowledge passed down from grandmothers who had lived on this land for generations. I pulled out my emergency flare gun and fired it straight up into the aurora-lit sky. The brilliant red light illuminated the lake for a quarter mile in every direction, revealing dozens of pale shapes moving in the dark water. The GPS beacon, I told Jake, in your pack. Fumbled with the device while I calculated distances and angles. The shore was 60 yards away, too far to jump, but maybe not too far to reach if we could get some help. The emergency flare drifted down slowly on its small parachute, but it had done its job. In the distance I heard the sound I'd been hoping for, the whine of snowmobile engines. The storm had ended, and other rangers were doing standard post-weather patrols. Signal for help, I told Jake. Use the whistle. Psychologist. He blasted 3 sharp notes, the universal distress signal. The snowmobile engines grew louder, heading toward our location. Alternating, the large creature watched this with what might have been approval. You think like the old ones, using all tools available. Good. You will need such thinking when the choice comes. When? I asked. Soon. The ice knows. 5 years, maybe 10. Then the normal ones will learn what we learned long ago. Survival requires sacrifice. The rescue snowmobiles crested the ridge overlooking the lake. Their headlights swept across the water, and I heard shouts of amazement as the rescuers saw the impossible scene. But as soon as the lights touched them, the creatures began to submerge. One by one, they sank back into the dark water without a splash. The large one was the last to go. Remember, when the ice speaks in the old language, wise people listen. When Tornarsuk wakes, even wise people must choose. Then it was gone, and we were alone on a rapidly shrinking piece of ice in the middle of a lake that should have been frozen solid. The rescue took 20 minutes, getting us back to solid ground another hour. But by the time we reached the station, with backup teams and proper equipment, Chandalar Lake was frozen solid again. No holes, no cracks, no signs that anything had ever disturbed its surface. Just normal winter ice under the dancing aurora lights. I resigned from the park service 6 months later. Because I was scared, though I was, but because I finally understood what my grandmother had been trying to teach me. Some knowledge comes with responsibility. Some warnings need to be passed down. I went back to the village where I grew up and started teaching traditional survival skills to anyone who would listen. Ice reading, cold weather hunting, how to find water sources when everything is frozen. The skills my ancestors had developed over thousands of years. But I also started paying attention to climate data, global temperature trends, ice coverage reports from around the Arctic. And slowly, over the years, I began to see the pattern the creatures had warned me about. The climate was changing, yes, but not in the direction most people expected. Solar cycles, ocean currents, atmospheric shifts, they were all pointing towards something scientists were just beginning to whisper about. A possible ice age. Not tomorrow, not next year, but within a human lifetime. When it comes, most people won't be ready. Jake Morrison requested a transfer to warmer climates and never spoke publicly about what happened at Chandalar Lake. The official report listed it as an equipment failure during severe weather conditions. No mention of creatures or voices or choices. But I still have the photos, and sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, I dream about pale eyes rising from dark water and ancient voices offering bargains that might be the only way to survive what's coming. 5 years have passed since that night on the lake. Climate scientists are beginning to publish papers about the possibility of rapid cooling. Ice coverage in the Arctic is expanding in unexpected patterns, and there have been reports. Other rangers in other remote areas, finding holes in ice that shouldn't exist. Hunters discovering tracks that don't match any known animals. People going missing in weather conditions that used to be survivable. The ice is speaking in the old language again. My grandmother died last winter. But before she passed, she told me something she'd never shared before. Her grandmother had seen them too, during the terrible winter of 1879, when half the village had starved. The creatures had made the same offer then: join us, or face the consequences of remaining unchanged. Her grandmother had refused, but she'd listened to the warnings. She'd taught her children and grandchildren the old ways, how to hunt when game was scarce, how to preserve food through long winters, how to read the signs the ice gave. Most importantly, she'd taught them that survival sometimes requires becoming something you never planned to be. I think about that a lot these days, especially when I'm teaching traditional skills to young people who've grown up with central heating and snowmobiles, and the assumption that human technology can overcome any natural challenge. I teach them how to build shelter from snow blocks, how to find fish under ice, how to make tools from bone and stone, skills that might matter when the power grids fail and the supply trucks can't get through, and the choice becomes very simple: adapt or die. But I also think about those pale eyes and that ancient hunger, and the terrible loneliness of being the only ones left when the ice finally wins. Wondering if the choice is really going to be as simple as the creatures made it seem: change or die. become something new, or join the majority who won't survive what's coming. And sometimes I think I can feel it starting already, a coldness that has nothing to do with weather, creeping into the world from places where the ice never completely melted, places where ancient things learned to wait. The aurora dances outside my window tonight, green and blue and silver against the star-filled darkness, beautiful and cold and patient, like everything else in this land that remembers what came before and what might come again. Somewhere out there, beneath the ice, Tornarsuk is waking up. Ice is starting to speak in the old language again. When that happens, my grandmother always said, "Wise people listen, even if they don't like what they hear."
My name is Vincent Beergrease, and I've been a forest ranger for 19 years. People always ask about my name. My grandmother told me it means conquering protector of the sacred bear in our old language. I'm Haida, born and raised on Prince of Wales Island in Alaska. These forests have been my home my whole life. 1973 was when everything changed. The rain had been falling for 3 weeks straight, turning the forest floors into muddy soup. The old cedar trees dripped constantly, making sounds like whispers in the dark. I was working alone that month, checking on the protected groves after the logging companies had finally been kicked out. Tongass National Forest covers most of our island. It's the biggest rainforest in America, full of trees older than Jesus. My job was to make sure nobody was cutting down the ancient ones anymore. The government had just made new rules about protecting old-growth forests, and the logging bosses were mad as hornets. I had a small cabin near Thorn Bay where I kept my equipment: radio, maps, camping gear, and my grandfather's old hunting rifle. The rifle was more for bears than anything else. Brown bears on our island grow bigger than anywhere else in the world. I'd seen them tear apart full-grown salmon like they were crackers. That October, I was checking areas where Haida families used to have their winter villages. My grandmother's grandmother had lived in these valleys before the white settlers came. She told stories about the forest spirits, about things that lived in the deepest parts of the woods. I always thought they were just stories to keep kids from wandering off. The ferry only came twice a week during winter months. Cell phones didn't exist yet, and radio signals got blocked by all the mountains. When you were out there, you were really alone. The silence could drive a man crazy if he wasn't used to it. I remember the first morning I noticed something was wrong. I was drinking coffee outside my cabin, watching the mist rise from the valley. The forest was too quiet. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter, no insects buzzing. Even the rain seemed to make less noise than usual. Then I heard something that made my coffee cup slip from my hands. It was crying. Human crying, coming from deep in the woods. A woman's voice, sobbing like her heart was broken. But there were no women within 50 miles of my cabin. I grabbed my jacket and radio, thinking maybe someone was lost. The crying stopped as soon as I stepped toward the tree line. I called out but got no answer. I searched for 2 hours, following old deer trails and checking every clearing. Nothing. No footprints, no signs anyone had been there. That night, I radioed headquarters in Ketchikan. "This is Ranger Beergrease at Thorn Bay Station. Anybody report missing persons in my area?" A long time before dispatch answered. "Negative, Vincent. Nearest people are the logging crew at Kaufman Cove, 40 miles south. Why?"
I almost told them about the crying, but stopped myself. Rangers who reported strange sounds didn't get promoted. They got desk jobs in Anchorage. "Just checking," I said. "Storm knocked down some trees near the old village sites. I'll file a report tomorrow." "Copy that. Stay safe out there." But I wasn't safe. Something was watching me from the woods, and I could feel it getting closer every day. The next morning brought more rain and something else. Tracks. Found them in the mud outside my cabin, pressed deep into the soft ground. At first I thought they were bear prints, but they were wrong. Too long, too narrow. The toes were spread out like fingers, and there were 5 of them instead of the usual bear claw marks.
Each print was 18 inches long and 8 inches wide. Whatever made them had to weigh at least 400 pounds. The stride length was incredible, nearly 6 feet between steps. I'd never seen anything like it in 19 years of forest work. I took pictures with my old Polaroid camera and measured everything twice. The prints led from the forest edge to my cabin window, then back into the trees. Something had been watching me sleep. My grandmother's voice echoed in my memory. "The old ones live in the deep forest, Vinny. They watch the sacred places. They don't like strangers." I'd always laughed at her stories about forest giants. Sasquatch legends were just logging camp nonsense, something bored men made up during long winter nights. Every logger claimed to have seen one, but nobody ever had real proof. These tracks were real proof. I followed them into the forest, my rifle slung across my shoulder and radio clipped to my belt. The trail wound between massive cedar trees, some of them 30 feet around. Moss hung from the branches like green curtains, blocking most of the sunlight. Everything smelled like wet earth and rotting leaves. The tracks led deeper than I'd ever gone in this valley. Past the marked trails, past the survey boundaries, into areas that hadn't seen human footprints in decades. The forest grew wilder with every step. Trees that had fallen centuries ago created natural bridges over hidden streams. Ferns grew taller than my head. After 2 hours of hiking, I found something that made my blood freeze. Confiscated. It was a deer, or what was left of one. The animal had been torn apart and arranged in a perfect circle around a huge cedar tree. The pieces were placed carefully, like some kind of ceremony. Legs pointing north, south, east, and west. The head was mounted on a broken branch, staring right at me. No bear did this. Bears ate their kills. They didn't arrange them like altar decorations. I raised my radio to call for backup, but only got static. The mountains were blocking my signal. I was completely alone with whatever had done this to the deer. That's when I heard the screaming. It came from above, from
somewhere high in the canopy. Not human, not animal, but something between the two. A sound like a woman's scream mixed with a grizzly's roar. The noise echoed through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere at once. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing. Just endless green forest stretching in all directions. The screaming stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving only the sound of dripping water and my own rapid breathing. Then the trees started moving. Psychologists, not swaying in the wind, there was no wind. They were bending toward me, like giant fingers reaching down. The branches creaked and groaned under some invisible weight. Leaves and moss fell like rain. I ran. Crashing through underbrush, splashing across hidden streams, I ran toward my cabin like a spooked deer. Behind me, the forest erupted in chaos. More screaming, closer now. The sound of massive footsteps pounding through the mud. Branches snapping under enormous weight. I didn't stop running until I reached my cabin door. Inside, I locked every window and loaded my rifle with the biggest shells I had. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely work the bolt. The forest had gone completely silent again. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the endless rain drumming on my roof and the sound of my own heartbeat. Something was out there, and it knew I'd found its secret place. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made me jump. Raindrops hitting windows, branches scraping the roof, my own breathing in the dark. I sat by the window with my rifle across my knees, watching the tree line for movement. Around 3 in the morning, I saw lights. Befloated between the trees like fireflies, but bigger and brighter. Blue-white orbs that danced through the forest, sometimes high in the branches, sometimes close to the ground. They moved with purpose, not randomly like real fireflies would. I'd heard about ghost lights in native stories. Spirits of the dead, my grandmother called them. But these felt different. Older. Like they'd been in this forest since the beginning of time. 3 times,
then vanished into the deep woods. At dawn, I found new tracks. Dozens of them, all around my cabin. The same 18-inch footprints, but now there were smaller ones too, like children's feet, but with the same strange toe spread. A whole family had visited me during the night. I had to get out of there. Radio for help, bring back a team with better equipment. Whatever was living in this forest was too big for one man to handle alone. But when I tried to start my truck, the engine was dead. I popped the hood and found my worst nightmare. Every wire had been cut clean through, like someone had taken scissors to them. The battery was missing entirely. I was trapped. The nearest road was 15 miles through unmarked forest. Without my truck, I'd have to hike out on foot. But that meant traveling through their territory, and they'd proved they could move faster than me. Conserved the morning checking my supplies. Food for maybe a week, water for 3 days if I was careful. My radio still couldn't reach through the mountains. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I heard voices, humans this time, calling my name from the forest. "Vincent! Vincent Bear Grease! Help us!" I knew it was a trick, but I couldn't ignore the possibility that someone was really in trouble. I grabbed my rifle and headed toward the voices, but stayed close to my cabin. "Where are you?" I called back. "Over here! We're hurt! Please help!" The voice sounded like Sarah Whitehorse, a teacher from Kaufman Cove. I'd met her a few times at the general store, but Sarah was supposed to be on the mainland visiting her sister. I followed the voice deeper into the forest. It led me to the same area where I'd found the arranged deer, but now something else was waiting for me. 3 people hung from the trees. They were suspended 20 feet up, wrapped in what looked like spider webs, but much thicker. Only their faces were visible, and they were all people I recognized from town. Tom Bellwether, the ferry captain, Mary Cahat, who ran the trading post, and Sarah Whitehorse herself. But they couldn't be real. Tom had been dead for the forter, and there was no one who was most interesting more. But they couldn't be real. Tom had been dead for the trees. I first took the trees me killed in a fishing accident. Mary had died last winter from cancer, and Sarah was supposed to be in Seattle. "Help us, Vincent!" Sarah's face called down to me. Her eyes were black holes, her skin pale as moonlight. "Join us. It's so peaceful here." That's when I saw them. 3 massive shapes stepped out from behind the cedar trees. They moved like apes, but stood like men, covered in dark brown hair that seemed to absorb light. Their faces were almost human, but wrong in every detail. Too long, too narrow, with eyes that glowed yellow in the forest shadows. The largest one was at least 9 feet tall and built like a truck. When it opened its mouth, rows of sharp teeth gleamed white against its dark gums. The scream that came out was the same sound I'd heard the day before. Flanked me on either side, cutting off my escape routes. They moved with intelligence, like a pack of wolves surrounding prey. I raised my rifle and fired at the big one. The shot echoed through the forest like thunder. The creature stumbled backward, but didn't fall. Dark blood leaked from its shoulder, but it just looked annoyed instead of hurt. All 3 of them screamed at once. The sound was so loud it felt like needles in my ears. Birds exploded from the trees in every direction. The hanging bodies above me started laughing. I ran again, but this time they followed, crashing through the forest behind me, screaming their rage. I could feel the ground shake under their massive feet. Branches snapped like toothpicks as they tore through the undergrowth. Salvation, I made it back to my cabin and slammed the door. But I knew it wouldn't hold them for long. These things were strong enough to flip my truck. A wooden door was nothing. Outside, they circled the cabin, howling like demons. I could see their shadows moving past the windows. Occasionally, a massive hand would slap against the walls, testing for weak spots. Then everything went quiet again. I waited by the door with my rifle ready, but they didn't attack. Hours passed. The sun went down. Still, nothing. Finally, I looked out the window and saw why they'd stopped. They were building something. Using fallen trees and massive stones, the creatures had built a cage around my cabin. I was trapped inside like an animal in a zoo. The walls of their construction rose 15 feet on all sides, too high to climb and too thick to break through. But the worst part wasn't being trapped. It was what I could see through the gaps. Weakest. More bodies hung from trees throughout the valley. Dozens of them, all wrapped in those thick cocoons. Some looked fresh, others had been there for years. All people who disappeared in these woods over the past decades. The creatures weren't just hunting for food. They were collecting. As night fell, the truth finally hit me. My grandmother's stories weren't myths. They were warnings. The Haida had shared thousands of years. The treaties and sacred sites weren't just about respect for nature. They were about keeping the deep forest undisturbed, keeping the old ones sleeping. Then the logging companies came. They cut down the ancient groves, destroyed the sacred places, and woke up things that should have stayed buried in legend. Around midnight, the largest creature approached my prison. It moved differently now, more carefully. In the moonlight, I could see intelligence in its yellow eyes. This wasn't just an animal, it was thinking. It spoke. The voice was like gravel sliding down a mountainside, barely recognizable as language. But I understood it, because some part of me remembered the old words my grandmother had taught me. You know the sacred places, it said. You have the blood. Flashlight, my Haida heritage. That's why I was still alive when everyone else had been taken. It recognized something in me, some genetic memory of the old agreements. Your people promised to protect the deep forest, it continued. But the cutters came anyway. They destroyed everything. The logging companies are gone, I said, my voice cracking with fear. The old groves are protected now. Too late. The creature's massive head shook sadly. The damage is done. The sacred boundaries are broken. We cannot return to sleep. That's when I understood the real horror. These things weren't evil. They were guardians, protectors of the ancient forest. But when their sacred places were destroyed, they'd become
something else. Something desperate and angry and lost. What do you want? I asked. A new keeper, it said. One who knows the old ways. One who can rebuild what was destroyed. It was offering me a choice. Join them willingly and help restore the forest balance, or end up like the others hanging in the trees. But there was a third option. Forensic. I thought about my grandfather's rifle, passed down through 4 generations of forest people. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of our responsibility to protect what was sacred. I can help, I told the creature, but not as your prisoner, as your partner. The yellow eyes studied me for a long moment. Then the massive head nodded once. The cage walls began to collapse piece by piece. The creature was freeing me, trusting me to keep my word. As the last barrier fell away, I understood what I had to do. Not just to survive, but to fix what had been broken. The logging companies were gone, but the damage remained. Destroyed sacred sites, broken boundaries, ancient treaties forgotten. Someone had to remember. Someone had to rebuild. Segregation. Someone had to stand guard. That was 30 years ago. I never left the forest. The official reports say Ranger Vincent Beargrease disappeared during a routine patrol in October 1973. Search teams found his abandoned cabin and vehicle, but no trace of what happened to him. The area was eventually closed to the public due to geological instability. Blurred, but I'm still here, still doing my job, just differently now. The creatures, I call them the old ones,
taught me things my forestry degree never covered. How to read the forest's moods, how to sense when the balance is shifting, how to communicate with things that predate human language by millions of years. Championships. Together, we've rebuilt the sacred boundaries, restored the ancient sites, replanted native species where the clear cuts once stripped the land bare. The forest is healing, slowly but surely. Sometimes hikers find their way into the deep valleys, despite all the warning signs. When they do, I make sure they leave quickly and safely. Usually, a glimpse of my changed appearance is enough to send them running. The years of living with the old ones have left their mark. My hair went white, my eyes changed color, and I've grown taller than any human should be. But I'm still human enough to remember why this matters. The oceans the world thinks the old forests are just trees and animals. They don't understand that some places are alive in ways that science can't measure. Some places remember things that happened before humans ever walked the earth. Microphone still works occasionally. I hear the modern world through static and interference. Satellites, computers, climate change. Humanity rushing toward a future they're not prepared for, forgetting the ancient bargains that keep darker things at bay. The logging companies are long gone, but new threats keep
coming. Mining interests, development projects, tourists who think the wilderness is just another theme park. Each time, I have to make a choice. Warn them away quietly, or let the old ones handle things their way. I use warnings, but not always. Last month, a team of developers showed up with chainsaws and blueprints, talking about luxury eco-resorts in the old-growth areas. They ignored the signs, brushed off the warnings, and started cutting anyway. The forest screamed. Not the old ones this time, the trees themselves, crying out as the saws bit into wood that had been growing since before Christ was born. I felt every cut like a knife in my chest, heard every falling giant like a gunshot. The developers are gone now. Their equipment sits rusting where they abandoned it, slowly being reclaimed by moss and ferns. The official story involves bears and equipment failures and insurance problems. The truth involves things that the modern world isn't ready to understand. I'm getting older. 55 years in the deep forest changes a man, even one with old one protection. Someday, I'll need a replacement. Someone young and strong and willing to stand between two worlds. Someone who understands that some boundaries must never be crossed. If you're reading this, maybe you're that person. Maybe you felt the call of the deep woods, heard whispers in languages older than civilization. Maybe you know, somewhere in your bones, that the world needs guardians for places too wild and sacred for human interference. The job pays nothing in money, but everything in purpose. And the forests of Prince of Wales Island are always hiring. Just remember, once you answer the call, there's no going back. The old ones don't give retirement packages. But they've immortality, of a sort. As long as the ancient trees stand, as long as the sacred boundaries hold, those who guard them never truly die. We just become part of something larger than ourselves. Something that remembers. Something that waits.